So please join me in welcoming Professor Julie Carlson to the Pollock Theater. She is the author of several books on British Romanticism, Mary Shelley, and legacies of friendship and creativity. Once again, I want to thank Julie Carlson for all of her assistance with our series and for her own work on campus to facilitate interdisciplinary conversations about Shelley's novel. So let's begin. So as a scholar of British Romantic era writing, what do you find most compelling about this biopic?
Mary Shelley. I like that it tries to take us through at least some of the complexity of her thinking that went into Frankenstein. I think to the extent people know Mary Shelley, I mean, other than scholars, they know Frankenstein, and they know Frankenstein usually as the monster, which of course it isn't even that. So this biopic is really trying to alter that view, give us a sense of the different kinds of issues that text is raising, but also the different kinds of philosophical and lived questions her life presented her with at a very young age. Mm-hmm. So I also like that it attempts to be quite loving toward reading and the sort of, but also passionate about it. I mean, anguished, angry, jealous, rageful, and that's the life for her, of her life, mm-hmm. or at least it's a huge aspect of the life of her.
So were there any surprises for you in the way that the film rendered the novel? Anything surprising?
Well, Percy's very good looking. Mary's very good looking.
Doesn't hurt in a movie,
Yeah. Well, it's you think about the kinds of choices when you know more of the biography. I think it's clearly trying to make the novel and Mary Shelley or Mary Godwin's or Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin's relation to it deeply feminist. And I don't think that's wrong, but I think certainly from scholars' approach to that text, that's a debate. Because some people see Frankenstein as a kind of reaction to both of her parents, mm-hmm. and that she, in Frankenstein, is very concerned of what we owe our creatures, and she is. So some of the readings, both in popular culture and certainly and also in scholarly culture, seem to want to foreground that she returns to a sort of domesticity, or at least a concern with the family that is overstated. And I think this film, it's interesting. It really does the feminist aspects of her independence, of she was thinking these things long before she met Percy. The part about the publication history is a little overstated on, mm-hmm. she's going to do it by herself and so on. At the same time that, we can talk about this more later, but it does also leave out more of the revolutionary and political context and makes it domesticated in ways that I think is overdone too. So it's a weird, so I mean, I think it opens up the question, as many things do. It depends on what we mean by feminism. It's certainly presenting, I'm going to say Mary Shelley, I should always really say Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin at this point, as a mind that is informed primarily by her parents and her lovers. Mm-hmm. And that's true and not true.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to build on that, I mean, the film makes a great deal of Mary's love of science, and there's many instances where it seems kind of forced. Mary, we know how much you love science. I mean, I know they're trying to work it in, but it also, yeah. It shows us mid-1800s, experiments with electricity, and attempts to bring back the dead to life. images of galvanism, the whole phantasmagoria, and as we were speaking, the kind of crossroads of science and magic, where science itself is kind of magical. There's something, but could you say a little bit more about, because I was really struck in the movie by, Mary loves science.
Yeah, Mary loves science. I know, that was a little odd. I mean, Mary loved a lot of things. And, it certainly, many people know this, in the period, there weren't as rigid of distinctions between poets, artists, surgeons, and natural philosophers. And her father's household, was abuzz with all these, with this confluence. And so it's partly through who was in the house when she was little, and certainly, Coleridge, that figures oddly in the film, but, is in the text an important backstory to Frankenstein, the Ancient Mariner, that is. But Coleridge also, Humphrey Davy and he were good friends, Joseph Priestley, so many of the major natural philosophers are part of the Godwin Shelley household. And of course, Percy Shelley, too, was, fascinated with electricity and so on. And Mary, certainly in the novel, she makes that link explicitly, where Victor Frankenstein's quest for science begins with the alchemists of the 14th century and makes that linkage. And it's partly about magic and science, but I think for Mary Shelley, it's really what lies behind both is imagination. And they don't stress that as much. They make it more, you like science, you like this. But I think for her, the issue is the relation of the new, that imagination brings in, discovery, that is both a scientific and a literary and certainly an artistic project. And the text for her, as well as, I think, some of these attempts to make the phantasmic and the scientific converge, is that we have to think new things, and they come from the arts or they come from science, and it's not as, the division is not as sharp.
Of course. Well, to bring it down to earth a little bit, one of the other things that struck me in the rendering of this film, and I'm not interested in it, how historically accurate it is, but much is made of the relationship between artistic life and economic necessity, and characters are even kind of framed by their relationship to this supposed opposition. So her stepmother is very much this kind of only concerned about money, making money, keeping, she has a businesswoman's approach. And yet, and Percy himself, he's cut off by his father, he borrows across his estate. They go from the heights of these incredible estates back to the flat in London. So could you talk a little bit about that, both in terms of in real life at the time, this kind of economic necessity and artistic life?
Yeah, this period is often understood to be as a certain, I hate when people say it's the moment when or it's the period when. It's often very hard to demarcate, but there is a professionalizing of the writer and a movement outside of patronage systems to marketplace systems. And, it is the case that Godwin, he's middle class, intellectual, but at this point in real life, when Mary Jane Clairmont and he marry, she has 2 children and he has 2, and then they have a fifth together. So there is, and they're on hard times financially because they loan money and they spend money, and so it's Mary Jane Godwin's idea to start the bookstore. But that also, so it's not just professionalizing of writing, where there's the question of it now more as a middle class pursuit that has to sell books, and it becomes they become commodities rather than more patronage products. But that's his livelihood at this point, is actually selling books, and it's partly a children's bookstore, because she translated for children's books, and that she worked for Tabert's before they got together. So like she had this background. So Mary, she's always called the second Mrs. Godwin, although Wollstonecraft never took the name Godwin, so I don't know why she's the second. But anyway, she never gets good press. I mean, in any of the biography, I mean, some female biographers have tried to do a little more, but you know, usually it is fairly ruthless. And I was surprised, you know, that this film stayed in that mold. You know, I mean, we don't have a lot of other independent evidence. We don't know really even what her last name is. Most people say it. I mean, before that's Vile. She's French, sort of. But anyway, so that's part of it. But I think what the film's also, so there's the question of class difference that, of course, Percy Shelley is the son of an aristocrat, and Godwin is trying to get his money. But then I think the other opposition feeds into this, not as explicitly, it's not just middle class versus aristocratic in terms of art, but it's practical and idealist. And you know, that's the fight at the end, or that's the debate. And Percy Shelley is often seen as more idealistic as compared to Byron on one hand, but also Mary Shelley. And so there is, even in Mary Shelley's second text after Frankenstein and Matilda, the Percy Shelley figure, Woodville, says that's kind of idealism speech, not quite as badly as here, but still, you know. And she says, the Matilda figure says, you know, you come to feed off of my misery, and you're about to make a poem out of it. I mean, it's a really strong statement. And she says to me, this is all dreary reality. And I think this film is partly doing that also with Shelley. Like, she's married Shelley, she's caught in a class thing, but it's also really a question of how do you approach life with hope or without it.
I was struck by the way the film highlights the relationship between her stepsister, between Mary and Claire Clairmont.
Yeah.
You know, and Mary promises Claire that they'll go around the world together, and Claire eventually, what struck me strongly watching it the second time, tonight was the third time, was how Claire becomes her preferred reader. I mean, Percy reads the novel and he, you know, wants to add these Enlightenment ideals of perfection and hope, but Claire reads it and gets it.
Yeah.
Immediately.
Yeah.
So, and we'll talk later, near the end of our conversation, about your own work on friendship. But I wondered if you'd say something about the relationship between Mary Shelley and Claire Clairmont, both what we know about them historically and how it was represented in this film.
Yeah, in the film, it's a fairly romanticized view. You know, that was a fraught relation. I mean, they were. Well, you know, they were. What would one say, foisted on each other, I mean, through the blended household. And, you know, when Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin goes to the Baxters, she goes earlier. I mean, she is sent with, first of all, her hand has become almost paralyzed. Like there's some sense of a disorder that is neurasthenic or something. And I think Godwin is, you know, I mean, he is worried about it, and she's consulted doctors, but there is this tension with Mrs. Godwin, and less with Claire at that point. But anyway, so this notion that, first of all, that she comes back for Claire is crazy. I mean, it has nothing. It isn't like that. But also, they aren't that close, and in fact, Mrs. Godwin sends Claire to boarding school, not away, but she gets more schooling. And so they don't have that kind of like, it's us against them. But on the other hand, it is the case, all three elope together. And not because Mary had promised, I'll show you the world, but just, I don't know why, really, because Percy likes a lot of women around. And so off they went. And, you know, they go in and out of friendship, that is, Claire and Mary. And, you know, the question of infidelity, you know, whether whether Percy and Claire have sex, probably, but it's never really clear. There's another baby that Percy adopts in Italy that no one knows really why or how or who. So, you know, that You know, so so this version is highly romantic.
Yeah,
romanticized.
it seems like the director really wants to foreground female friendship.
Yeah.
And there's that terrible moment. Well, it's both. We're supposed to look at it as this incredible moment when the Clara, the baby, and Percy and Shelley and Mary, and we're a threesome.
Yeah.
And so it upsets a prior threesome.
Right.
And Claire comes in and realizes, and then she goes off to make her hit on the big poet.
Yeah.
And but it is this way that she is somehow being excluded from what had been their threesome. But it's interesting what you say, because I think the film really tries. The filmmaker, because she so wants this to be a feminist take on Mary Shelley's life and choices, that the relationship with Claire is really central to that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, Claire was with Mary for a long time. Right. I mean, certainly after Percy died too. But, Percy and Mary start a journal together when they're traveling, and when they elope and then come back and go. And I mean, Mary takes it over ultimately because Percy's busy with other things. But it is one of the places where they communicate in code about Claire, because they feel like Mary can't really talk. There's always these intrusions and these overheard conversations, and yes, it's fraught. And Claire does say, this was a family where, if you weren't an author, you weren't anybody.
So she's a singer.
Yeah, so she's a singer.
Yeah.
And I mean, one other thing that the film, it isn't really what you were asking, but one of the things that, obviously their lives are so complex, a lot has to get streamlined. But what's left out altogether is Mary's other stepsister, Fanny, who's Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter by Imlay. And that's sad. That's sad, but it's that they were closer. And it's really Fanny's story of rejection that's the strongest one. Fanny commits suicide the same year Harriet does. Right. So it's a mess, yeah.
Well, speaking of a mess, critics have not been generous in their assessment of this film.
Oh, no.
While they often celebrate the focus on Mary Shelley rather than the Frankenstein monster, they also describe the film as, at best, quote, a moderately interesting historical drama, and at worst, filmed in a manner that would be more at home on the CW network rather than Showtime or HBO. Woo. So what do you think accounts for this critical reaction? Do you share any of it? Or do you think that maybe the story of Mary Shelley's life is hard to get right, would be very hard to get right in a 2-hour format?
Yeah. I don't think it's a brilliant film, but I think it's more serious than that. And I think, her life is extremely hard to get correct. Just so much is going on. So many people are living, dying, coming and going, and so on. And what she's trying to synthesize or react to and against, it would take too long to show. So, I think.
Well, like for instance, with you would know exactly. Did she lose 3 children in the time when she leaves with Percy?
Well, so.
But they only show one. They show one.
Yeah. Well, the other 2 don't die. This ends with the publication of Frankenstein. So the publication date is January 1st, 1818. So at that point, only the one baby has died. But they superimpose the circumstances. That it got sick and that Percy made them leave the house. That's about the second Clara. Yeah. And the first one was premature. Okay. And so William is born by the time Frankenstein. Well, William and Clara are both born, but they don't. And Clara dies in 1818, but not till May. And then William dies in June of 1819. And then so there's only Percy Florence survives,
who she walks with at the end. Yeah, no, but I'm saying as a way of, so we see, foreshadowings of the cradle rocking, and then her dreams of the cradle rocking, the empty cradle, the cradle with the, so it's I don't know if that's her effort of the director to kind of suggest a longer process of loss.
Yeah, I mean, she's certainly, yeah, she's alluding, I think, to a lot of them. I mean, like the Clara. Some people say the first child baby isn't named, but then some others do call it Clara. I thought it wasn't named, but anyway, it was a girl. And, but you know, there's also, of course, her dead mother, but what I also think, it comes back to the science question too. It's not just galvanism that, you know, and Humphrey Davy's stuff on chemistry and transformation. It's that Mary Wollstonecraft, you know, and they allude to it once, although they say it's with Fuseli, but it was really Imlay. But anyway, you know, she does try to kill herself twice. And the second time, you know, she jumps in the Thames, and so she's pulled out of the water. But the Humane Society at that point, it's getting going, and so there's a lot of discourse about resuscitation, and so it's not just the dead baby and the rubbing by the fire or galvanism. It's also that, you know, Wollstonecraft was dead. I mean, yes. Or was, you know, was resuscitated, and that's what's really harrowing. I mean, that's not in the film, but she did not want to. I mean, she left a note, made it clear she did not want to be resuscitated. And so again, this is all in Godwin's memoir, and Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin has read it. And knows then that actually not only did her mother die giving birth to her, her mother had killed herself before. So, you know what I mean? The issue of the boundaries between life and death and birth and writing and progeny is very complex for her. And so, you know, what film could really do that? So I think it does try through some of these devices. Some are a little heavy-handed, but there are moments where there's actually, I think, something quite poetic going on.
Well, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the film's director. And I've written something, so allow me to get it right for you. Saudi Arabian filmmaker Haifa al-Mansour came to attention in 2012 with her first film, Vaja, which told the story of a young Saudi girl determined to raise money for a bicycle despite resistance from her conservative community. Girls can't ride bikes, women can't drive. It was the first feature-length film ever directed by a female Saudi Arabian director. And for her second film, she wanted to do an English-speaking project. And her agent sent her the script, the Mary Shelley script, and she was moved by the story of a woman seeking her own voice, her own path. And she, in interviews, and I know you watched some of them too, al-Mansour felt that her film is a much-needed corrective to how Shelley is usually overshadowed by her creation. So what can you tell us about female artists and female authors like al-Mansour's long-standing interest in Mary Shelley?
I think Mary Shelley is for women artists, at least some, and women critics. Well, actually, I was gonna use the same word I often use in terms of the creature. I mean, so she is an epitome of that for them. I mean, the embodiment of someone who wrote throughout her life in very, you know, I mean, Wollstonecraft fought more battles than Shelley, but still, Shelley lived longer, and Shelley's work evolved in, you know, and the sort of publishing world was getting more receptive to women, but still not, you know, lots of texts were published anonymously or pseudonymously. And, you know, Mary Shelley's name was affixed to Frankenstein in the second edition after it became a play. But, you know, I think, anyway, to get back to al-Mansour, I think she, you know, given especially what she was trying to do with Wajda, where she's 10, the girl. Right. And it's, you know, and yes, in an even more repressive situation, but I think she, you know, she was drawn to Mary Shelley as, wow, I mean, Frankenstein is one of the most referred to texts in the Western canon, you know? And she was a teenager when she wrote it. I mean, a late teenager, but still 18 when she started it. And so I think that does captivate a lot of people's, but also women artists' minds, you know, because this book is so prescient, you know, and whatever angle in the text interests you, you know, whether it's more the thing about bioethics or life and death or relationality and so on, it keeps evolving with the times. Mm-hmm. And you know, there are some aspects of the text that people would find outdated, but in general, in some ways, it's more timely now than it was even then. Or at least there's more people maybe that yeah. that identify with the different things that she's trying to explore. So, you know, I know that Al-Mansour was saying that she was attracted to the strength of the voice and kind of the strength of the voice and the depth of the seriousness with which the text tries to, and with which Mary Shelley as an author person tried to address complexity, I guess is the best way I can say it, and not resolve things. You know, Frankenstein doesn't really resolve, it more demolishes.
Right. You know? Implodes.
Yeah.
Well, so we spoke a little bit about this, but I think maybe the audience would be interested in hearing. So what do scholars, as apart from female artists or authors or directors, but what do scholars say when they compare Mary Shelley to her famous mother, in terms of who is the more feminist writer and so on?
Yeah, well, in general, people see Wollstonecraft as more feminist, and Mary Shelley as, in a certain way, pulling back from some of the autonomy or independence that Mary Wollstonecraft advocated. I mean, you know, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote nonfiction as well as fiction, but you know, her last work is fiction that rewrites her nonfiction work, Vindication of the Rights of Woman, as the wrongs of woman. And Mary Shelley's, you know, in Frankenstein, she's angry about a number of things. And then but she keeps writing novels, and they get, you know, in the late 20s and 30s, people call them often silver fork novels, which means domestic fiction and kind of certainly of a much safer sensibility. So feminist critics or critics more generally, well, most people only read Frankenstein, and they don't even read Frankenstein. So, you know, if you read Shelley, you read Frankenstein. And hardly anybody reads like Ladora and Matilda. No. But those who do are you know, there's usually a whiff of disappointment.
I see.
And Mary Shelley does say in the 1830s, because somebody's writing her about joining a particular cause, and she says, you know, my parents did the causes, Percy did the causes, kind of like that, you know, I don't do the causes. And for me, you know, we were saying this, it depends on what you mean, you know, what one means by feminist. So it's not an interesting, I mean, you're not saying it that way. It's not an interesting debate to me who was more feminist.
Right.
But I think what I like about what Shelley's doing, and I think it's feminist, if you want to put it that way, I mean, I like the term feminist, is she's trying in so many ways to explore the consequences of this or that project or idea. And she considers herself, I mean, that is true, you know, at the end of the film, that when she's writing the voice of the creature. So the text is the movie is identifying the creature's voice with her own. And that's valid to a certain extent. But she's also, she was an experiment. She was an experiment of radical parents who didn't believe in marriage and who, you know, were about a kind of revolutionary independence, and who, and she is like, well, okay, you know, if you're going to experiment, and if you're going to especially bring into the world radically new ideas. Part of what Frankenstein's interested in is, are you responsible, or shouldn't you give a thought at least to what kind of reception this new being will meet? And so I think her sticking with these questions, and then, same thing, I mean, it touches on that in the film, where she'll often, they did fall in love, Percy and Mary, and I like the passion that that was there, and it was all tied up with meeting at the mother's grave, and Percy coming to work with Godwin, so it's all a hothouse of whoever's with whoever, but she also then confronts what those choices have caused. Well, and she thinks he isn't, or that's how the film depicts it, although at the end he does, they both sort of come to some agreement about that. But so I think I find Mary Wollstonecraft laid out a certain agenda, which, of course, the problem for Mary Wollstonecraft that the film also raises is that, there are many contradictions, obviously, between what she says and what she does, including suicide over men and so on. And people get all bothered, how's that possible? What's feminist about that? And so I think it's true of Wollstonecraft, too. It's like, hello, people. These things are not simple. You can still advocate certain things and not yet, be in a position to enact them fully. And so they both are really trying to be open about passion.
Well, I think one thing we'll explore in the rest of this series, and I've read here and there critics saying that really Frankenstein is a story. You're saying here it's depicted as Mary, that she's concerned with consequences, and later in her life she's not for causes. That was her parents' generation or Shelley's, but not her. And some have suggested that Frankenstein as a story is a kind of post-revolutionary story, like when the cause fails or the cause is not meant. So for instance, there's a lot of Frankenstein remakes in the 70s, we're going to see a couple of them here. We'll see Spirit of the Beehive set in kind of post-Franco Spain, and then we're going to, we'll watch Young Frankenstein, which is also, 1974, after the 60s, after, certain idealisms and calls to action have been transformed.
Right.
So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, as Frankenstein is a kind of post-revolutionary text. I mean, certainly in a British tradition, it's very, I don't know, I'm just wondering what you think.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is read that way. And, he goes to Ingolstadt, the creature, is that right? Let's see. Anyway, that doesn't matter. It was about the terror anyway, so that's that's in the Revolution. But yeah, so again, the context is radical change.
Right.
And I think, again, because of what I said before with Shelley's attention to kind of unfolding consequences, I don't think it's anti-revolution.
Right. People
sometimes see it as reactionary. I think that's, I hate these categories and these, because, same with the 70s, there are certain epochs, like the 1790s and the 1960s, are understood to be these sort of radical generations of hope or idealism. The whole point about idealism is it's ideal. And, so it's not like it's going to be realized. Those are, right? But, so the work starts there.
Yeah.
And she stays with those ideas. But the work starts with having a less binary view about dream vision and social practice.
Right. Well, I want to just shift as we come to the end of our questions before we open it up to the audience. In your own work on British Romanticism, and one of the things when you came to my graduate seminar and you talked about, there's all these different approaches to Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, and And you know, over the years, you said you've really settled. You're really interested in questions of friendship, and you know, non-conventional friendships, different kinds of families and affiliations. And I wondered if you'd say more about that. One of the things I think I mentioned at the beginning, but maybe I didn't. But you know, when I looked across, when we were trying to see what, because it is the 200th anniversary, there's all kinds of retrospectives and so on and so forth, and most of them are focused on questions of bioethics and science and what's, you know, these are pressing questions right now. But you said that your own interest has moved more and more towards questions of friendship. So I wondered if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, as a reading of Romanticism, yeah, I mean, so part of what I'm trying to talk about is what I see as the radical legacy of British Romanticism is the way that, and this touches a little bit on what you just asked me, but is that the discourse about social change, the relational structure that was seen as most likely to be conducive to justice was friendship. So it has the Friends of Man philosophy that, you know, was what was galvanizing, you know, the sense of democracy. So that's one thing. British Romanticism is also understood to be a period of enormous friendship between people, especially Wordsworth, Coleridge, Godwin, and Holcroft, and so on. And so I'm just partly trying to keep those two frameworks in conversation with each other, along with the third, which is often seen as a reaction, in, you know, a disillusioned reaction to the Friends of Man philosophy, which is, for them, they start talking about books as friends or writing as friendship. So for me, the radical legacy of British Romanticism is to triangulate those object relations of friends. So it is, you know, friendship, you know, interpersonal friendship linked as the mechanism toward an outward, you know, we wouldn't talk about Friends of Man or any universal benevolence anymore, but certainly as an expansive, as they would say, an opening out of the heart. And for them, the nuclear family, for Godwin and Wollstonecraft, the nuclear family impedes that. It's an impediment to justice. Not, again, that all families do that, but that the structure of the nuclear family impedes justice because it not only relies on, but it sanctions. I mean, it allows you to feel good about caring about your own. And for Godwin and Wollstonecraft, that's tribalism. That's a problem. So that's that for them. So that was understood to be the radical relation. But for me, that's not enough. What they were really doing, that I think is what I was saying, where the work begins is when the idealism fades. And that is, that I think culture, especially in that period writing, but now we'd say the arts more generally, have to be understood as part of what is mediating interpersonal relations and any sort of outward-looking, more global, or at least more humane, if you want to put it, prospect. And without the third dimension, we just get in again to this, you're my friend, now you're not, you know, especially, I mean, you know, especially if we're trying to be allied on political causes, then you hurt my feelings and I'm done. You know, we need to be ballasted in that, in cultural work more generally. So that's what's important for me. And that's why in this text, I mean, in this film, I'm sorry that it stays in that regard so domestic, because, you know, even though it, you know, so it does the free love thing, but it's kind of cynical about that. I mean, you know, in other words, we side more with the women, and, you know, we aren't really taking Percy and Byron that seriously, right? So that for me loses part of what the critique of the nuclear family was for them. But again, it is the case that Mary Shelley, I think, is less sure about that for all the dead babies.
You're right.
You know, and the dead babies is the real, you know, it's a real issue. But it just doesn't have to be a familial. I mean, one should care about dead babies.
Right.
Or, you how to generate infant life without it having to be your own and having to then make it back into some heteronormative thing.
Right.
So.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Julie Carlson for helping us kick off the series and giving us lots to think about as we watch these other films, which I think many of you will be familiar, but we're going to look at them in new ways. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.